Hello, I am a senior in high school, and I have read a lot of books in high school, so let's make a tier list out of it. I have the letters on the floor, S through F. C being absolutely neutral opinion, didn't like it or dislike it. Anything above C tier, I liked it. Anything below C tier, actively disliked it. Okay, so here's all of the books that I read over high school. Some of them are just little sheets of paper because I never picked up the book, but I still want to talk about them. They're in order from when I read them in high school right now. And this is all one person's opinion. I definitely know a couple of books that are just totally on people's opposite end of the spectrum. Some of the books that I absolutely love, a handful of people I know absolutely hate. So let's all be respectful of everyone's opinions. I never really would have considered myself an English guy, but I've actually liked a handful of these books. So let's get to it. Alright, the first thing I read in ninth grade was The Lord of the Flies. I remember being absolutely terrified to start reading like high school books, and it was actually not as bad as I thought. I kind of enjoyed the book, didn't dislike it. It was a decent book. Uh, Not a great ending. I'm not gonna spoil any books if you guys actually want to read some of these. So, B tier book, moderately interesting. All right, next up was the Odyssey. We kind of skipped over this, and I have basically no recollection of it, but we did read it, and I didn't get the physical copy of the book. Because I have literally no recollection of it, I'm gonna put it in C tier, because I guess I didn't stick it in my mind as something I absolutely hate, but it's not a memorable book from what I read. So that does it for the books that I read in ninth grade. My ninth grade got cut off due to COVID, and so I just read two books, and that was it. Next up is How to Read Literature Like a Professor. This is a summer book between my ninth and 10th grade, and so we were supposed to read and kind of understand a couple of chapters, not the entire thing, but it was actually moderately useful to help understand books, especially in AP Lit as a senior. So I'll put it in like the bottom of B tier. Here's another summer book that I read for my AP seminar class called The Book of Joy. It was also not very memorable. I have no recollection of it, but it's by the Dalai Lama. I remember being moderately interested at best, so I'm gonna put it above the Odyssey because I vaguely remember it, but I frankly don't remember too much about that book. It was also not very memorable. Alright, the first book we read in 10th grade was Of Mice and Men. I'm gonna put it above How to Read Literature Like a Professor. It was an interesting story. I don't really like super modern books from like the modernist period, the mid 1900s, like the early mid 1900s, so about 1920, 1946. That's the modernist period, and I don't really like literature from that time period from what I've gathered in reading modern literature. So I'm just gonna put it in middle of B tier. Alright, next up is Night by Elie Wiesel. This book is also from that time period, but I read it twice. I read it in 8th grade and in 10th grade, and I never really found it too interesting. It was okay, but I could never really get into it. It's one of those just modernist books that I just couldn't get into. Alright, next up is The Catcher in the Rye. I gotta put it at borderline S tier, honestly. Or like the top of A tier, maybe S tier. Yeah, I know I just said I hate modernist books, but I don't know. The Adventures of Holden, it was just so interesting. I remember seeing that this book was one of the books that was banned. I'm like, yeah, I know why. Because there's a lot of swearing in it. A lot. But overall, it's a pretty good book, so I'll give it the top of A tier. Here's where a lot of people would disagree with me. The Scarlet Letter is my favorite book of all time. Oh yeah, by the way, that was the book I read for the summer of 11th grade. Also, I'm gonna bump How to Read Literature down to C tier. I don't know why I really liked The Scarlet Letter. This was for AP Lang, so we didn't really read any other books. This was just kind of a summer book we read to kind of just get introduced to the idea of like just harder works in general. And just because it's my favorite book doesn't mean wasn't an easy book. It was very difficult. The hardest book that I ever read by far at that point in my life. But I think seeing the development of someone who was shunned uh, kind of at the beginning and seeing how they develop was so interesting to me. And the ending, I'm not going to spoil it, but that is what made that book my favorite book of all time. I was just like, my jaw literally dropped. I was like, and now it's my favorite book of all time. So we literally only read one book in 11th grade in AP Lang. So now on to AP Lit. Oh, I completely forgot about this book. Hold up. That wasn't even meant to be a joke. Like, I it is not memorable at all. It was the biggest waste of time reading it. And there's probably some important stuff from it, but I just don't remember it. And I remember just actively kind of disliking it when I read it. It was a book that we read at the beginning of AP Lang to get us to learn how to write better, and I got literally nothing from it. We didn't really talk about it. It was just like read this and take notes and then turn in. That was the assignment. So I got absolutely nothing from it. I don't think it made me much of a better writer. Meanwhile, the How to Read Literature Like a Professor, at least it helped a little bit, but whatever. Now on to AP Lit. So this is a book that we read for summer. Just to get us into AP Lit. And I will give Frankenstein an A tier. It's a good book. It was interesting. When I was about to start reading it, I kind of just pictured a walking zombie thing, and it was just gonna be kind of a zombie movie, but in book form. But it was not that. It was a lot more depth to it, and it was kind of interesting to read and discuss in class. I really like the discussions we have in AP Lit, much better than like the kind of grade level pre-P ninth and 10th grade classes, and much better than AP Lang. Just the discussions were a lot better. And just discussing this book was very interesting, kind of seeing the different perspectives, and it led me into another book. This is kind of a sub book while we were still talking about Frankenstein, but to just kind of understand the analysis of it better, and that was John Milton's Paradise Lost, and that gets an S tier. It's pretty good. As a person with a strong Judeo-Christian background, it was very interesting to go see kind of how Milton tried to interpret things, because he didn't want to take away from kind of what the Bible was saying, so but he tried to make kind of cool interpretations, and so it's just kind of cool to see how he extended on kind of the story of Genesis, if you've read that, and the love scene between Adam and Eve, and in that book, Milton, top notch. It is John Milton though, so it's quite difficult to understand what's going on. But it was a great book. I absolutely loved it. Alright, on to our medieval works. We started with Beowulf. I'll put that at the top of B tier, I think. So move Of Mice and Men, move Lord of the Flies, Beowulf. Beowulf, compared to some of the other stuff, I think I might put it below Lord of the Flies, actually. Because it, in my opinion, it had less of a plot than Lord of the Flies, Frankenstein, The Scarlet Letter, Paradise Lost. It had less of an interesting plot to me. It was still really cool, and we learned a lot about medieval kind of culture and stuff. But I would still recommend Beowulf, especially if you're trying to start getting into upper level high school reading, and you're trying to just get used to harder works. And so we kind of did that because we did Beowulf in probably about September. Alright, next up is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I'll put it almost tied with Paradise Lost. It's a really good book. It's more of a short story, and that's why we don't have the full copy. But of the two medieval books that we read in AP Lit, there's a lot more of an interesting plot, and I really liked kind of just the development of the story and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So I forgot to put it down there. But I'm also gonna put Macbeth. Where do I want to put Macbeth? S or A tier? I'm gonna put it in S tier. I really liked Macbeth. I think I'm a bit biased because that essay was my first ever A on an essay in AP Lit. Also on my reading log, I got 100 and I felt so smart because compared to my other English teachers I had in high school and middle school, my AP Lit teacher grades a lot harder than my other teachers did, and so I felt so accomplished getting 100 on my reading log and A on my essay for the very first time. But kind of information about the book, I kind of really enjoyed the plot of this. It was a bit difficult to decipher what was going on, but not nearly as bad as Paradise Lost. I thought the idea of the weird sisters was integrated kind of well, and kind of how they didn't explicitly state something, and so that was like how certain events in the story happened. I'm not trying to spoil anything, obviously. And just kind of the relationships between characters. Very well done, Shakespeare. Very well done. I might have to go read some Shakespearean plays on my own time. All right, we have the comedy unit, and so these are more short stories that we didn't really talk about. Also, we acted out a couple of scenes from Macbeth in my AP Lit class to just describe kind of a theme, and my group got the highest score, so I am very biased with Macbeth, but I still really loved it. I don't know how this is a comedy. That's all I'm gonna say. We were supposed to act out part of this because like the funny part, I have a weird sense of humor like this guy, like Moliere, but I didn't find it funny. It wasn't that interesting to me. I have nothing else to say about it. It just wasn't funny. It was supposed to be a comedy, and I couldn't figure out why it was a comedy. Next is Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. I'll put that at the bottom of B tier. At least I could see how this one is funny. It was just a massive play on the word earnest. And so it was kind of interesting. Significantly more interesting than the misanthrope, at least. But it was not super funny for a comedy. But at least I can get why it's funny. And last, and definitely not least, Wuthering Heights. I will put it at the top of A tier. Alright. Wuthering Heights. Everybody is a terrible person. It was a tiny bit difficult to understand, especially closer to the end, because it's jumping back and forth between flashbacks and the present, and then it goes like to the future. And during the process of reading it, it probably would have been C tier or low B tier, because there was no character that I liked. They're all terrible people. But the analysis part and the discussion part and kind of thinking of it and analyzing the book is really interesting, to me at least. Just kind of looking at the relationship between Catherine and Kathy, and uh, how Catherine is basically a product of the society that she's put into. We had to do a research project on Wuthering Heights and kind of do a presentation on it, and I think that's what made me really like the book a lot more than many of the other things we read that year, because I did mine on capitalism and how that's basically caused every single issue in the story. My class really seemed to like it, and so did my teacher, because I was one of only a few people to get an A on that project, which is pretty cool. I threw a dice on the floor and it made my teacher laugh, which is pretty cool. Definitely the reason why I got an A, just because I threw a dice. But it's a pretty interesting book to analyze. So here's the entire tier list. We got The Scarlet Letter, Paradise Lost, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Macbeth in S tier. We got Wuthering Heights, The Catcher in the Rye, and Frankenstein in A tier, Lord of the Flies, Beowulf, Of Mice and Men, and The Importance of Being Earnest in B tier. We got How to Read Literature Like a Professor at Night, The Book of Joy, and The Odyssey in C tier, On Writing Well and The Misanthrope in F tier. I hope you found this interesting, and remember, this is always just one person's opinion. Goodbye.